The ground shook before anyone understood why. Elira dropped the basket of linens she was carrying and grabbed the stone wall of the courtyard to keep from falling. Around her, servants screamed and scattered, and somewhere above the castle, thunder rolled across a clear sky. She looked up, confused, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then she saw it. The black wolf statue in the center of the royal courtyard, the one every servant had been warned never to touch, was glowing. A thin golden light traced along its stone legs, its curled tail, its lowered head. The light pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat trying to remember how to beat. Elira had lived in Kael'mor Castle since she was old enough to carry a mop, and in all those years, she had never once seen the statue do anything but sit silently under the rain and snow. The guards called it the sacred wolf. The old cook, Marta, called it a dead thing that should have been buried instead of displayed. No one touched it. No one dared walk too close to it. Children were told stories about a curse that would fall on anyone foolish enough to lay a hand on the stone. Elira had never believed those stories. But standing there now, watching light crawl over 400 years of silence, she felt her whole body go cold. "Move away from it," someone shouted. She turned to see two guards running toward her, their spears lowered, their faces pale with something close to fear. Elira stepped back instinctively, putting distance between herself and the statue. But the moment she moved, the light dimmed. It did not vanish completely. It simply faded to a soft ember glow, like a fire banked for the night, waiting. "I didn't do anything," Elira said, her voice shaking. "I was only walking past. I swear I didn't touch it." The younger guard, a broad-shouldered man named Callum, stared at her like she had grown a second head. "You were standing beside it. No one stands beside it. No one has stood beside it in 400 years. "I didn't know," Elira said. "I was carrying laundry. I always walk this way." The older guard did not answer her. He turned and ran toward the main hall, shouting orders as he went, calling for the captain, calling for the king. Word spread through the castle faster than fire through dry grass. By the time the sun began to set, every servant, every guard, every noble visiting the court that week had heard some version of the story, each one stranger than the last. Some said the statue had opened its eyes. Some said it had let out a low growl that shook the castle foundations. Some said the servant girl had spoken an ancient word and the stone had answered her. None of it was true. But Elira found herself sitting alone in the small storage room she called her quarters, staring at her own hands, as if they might explain what had happened. She did not come from nobility. She did not come from any family at all, as far as anyone knew. She had been found as an infant near the northern mountain border, wrapped in a plain gray cloth, left at the edge of a trading path, where a merchant caravan discovered her crying in the cold. No note, no name, no sign of who had left her there, or why. The castle had taken her in out of duty rather than kindness, and she had grown up doing the work no one else wanted to do, sleeping in rooms too small for anyone else, eating what was left after everyone else had eaten first. She had learned, early on, not to expect much from the world, and the world, in turn, had mostly left her alone. Until tonight. A hard knock on her door made her jump. Before she could answer, the door opened, and Captain Rowan stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He was not a cruel man, but he was not a warm one either, and the seriousness in his eyes told Elira this was not a casual visit. "The king wants to see you," he said, "now." Elira's stomach dropped. In all her years living in Kael'mor Castle, she had never once spoken to the king. She had seen him from a distance, crossing the hall in his dark coat, surrounded by advisors and guards, his presence commanding silence wherever he walked. Alpha King Cassian Draven ruled not only the castle, but the entire territory of shifting wolves that made up the kingdom, and though Elira was human, she had learned quickly that his authority extended over every living soul within these walls, wolf or not. "What did I do wrong?" she asked, her voice smaller than she meant it to be. "That," Rowan said, gesturing toward the window, toward the courtyard beyond it, "is exactly what he wants to find out." She followed him through the corridors of the castle, past tapestries depicting battles she did not recognize, past portraits of alphas, long dead, their painted eyes seeming to watch her as she passed. The castle at night felt different than it did during the day. quieter, in a way that pressed against her ears, as if the stone itself were listening. They reached the throne room, and Rowan pushed the heavy doors open, before stepping aside to let her enter alone. Cassian Draven stood near the tall windows at the far end of the room, his back to her, looking out over the courtyard where the statue still glowed faintly in the dark. He did not turn around right away, and Alira stood frozen near the doorway, unsure whether she was meant to speak first or wait. "Come closer," he said finally, his voice low and controlled, carrying easily across the empty hall. Alira crossed the long room, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor, and stopped several paces behind him, close enough to be respectful, far enough to feel safe. When Cassian finally turned to face her, she understood immediately why people spoke of him the way they did. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of stillness that made a person feel like they were being studied by something far older than his years suggested. His eyes were a pale gray, sharp and unreadable, and they moved over her now with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Tell me what happened in the courtyard," he said. "I was carrying laundry to the drying line," Alira said carefully. "I walked past the statue like I always do. I didn't touch it. I didn't say anything to it. I don't even know why I stopped." "You stopped." "I felt something," she admitted, though she wasn't sure it was wise to say it out loud. "A kind of pull. I thought I was imagining it." Cassian's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of interest he did not seem to want her to see. "That statue," he said, "has stood in this courtyard for 400 years. It was placed there by the first Alpha King of this territory, my ancestor, and it has not moved, has not glowed, has not so much as gathered warmth from the sun in all that time. Do you understand what you are telling me?" "I'm not telling you anything," Alira said. "I don't understand what happened any more than you do." "That is difficult to believe. It's the truth," she said, and for the first time since entering the room, she felt something other than fear rise in her chest, a small, stubborn spark of frustration. "I am a servant here. I clean floors and carry linens. I have no reason to lie to you, and no way to explain something I don't understand myself." Cassian studied her for a long moment, long enough that she began to feel the silence pressing against her skin. Then he walked past her, toward the doors, and gestured for her to follow. "Come with me," he said. She hesitated only a second before obeying, falling into step slightly behind him as he led her through the castle, toward a part she had never been permitted to enter, a narrow hallway lined with old books and older maps, ending in a small circular room, with a single desk, and shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with worn leather volumes. An elderly man sat at the desk, hunched over a thick book, his silver hair catching the candlelight. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of the king arriving unannounced at this hour. "Eldon," Cassian said, "tell her what you told me an hour ago." The old man, who Alira would later learn was the castle's historian, closed his book slowly and folded his hands on the desk. His gaze moved to Alira with an expression she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or something closer to disbelief. "There is a prophecy," Eldon said, "written by the first Alpha King himself, in the earliest records of this kingdom. It speaks of the sacred wolf, the guardian bound into stone to protect a balance the king feared his descendants might one day forget. The prophecy says the guardian will wake only when one who does not belong stands where she is not expected, and the blood of the mountain recognizes her own." Alira felt a chill move through her. "That has nothing to do with me." "Perhaps not," Eldon said gently. "But you are the only person in 400 years to stand beside that statue and see it respond." "I'm human," Alira said, looking between the old man and the king. "I don't have any blood of the mountain. I don't have any family at all. I was found as a baby with nothing. No name, no history, nothing to connect me to anyone." "That," Cassian said quietly, "is precisely what concerns me." The room fell silent. Alira could hear her own heartbeat again, steady but fast, and she wrapped her arms around herself without meaning to, suddenly aware of how small she felt standing between the king and centuries of history she knew nothing about. "What happens now?" she asked. Cassian's eyes moved to hers, and for a moment, something in his expression softened, just slightly, before hardening again into the same controlled distance he had worn since she entered the throne room. "Now," he said, "you will not go far from this castle until I understand what is happening. You will return to your quarters, and tomorrow you will be brought to the courtyard again. To stand beside the statue? To see if it happens again." Illyra wanted to protest, wanted to say she had nothing to do with ancient prophecies or sacred guardians, that she was simply a servant who wanted to finish her chores and sleep before another long day of work. But something about the way Cassian looked at her, something about the way the statue had glowed the moment she stood near it, told her that no matter what she said, her life had already changed in ways she could not yet understand. She left the small library room with Rowan escorting her back through the quiet halls, and when she passed the window overlooking the courtyard, she paused, drawn by something she couldn't name. The statue's eyes, carved shut for 4 centuries, appeared to be open just slightly, a thin line of shadow where solid stone had been the day before. Illyra told herself it was a trick of the moonlight, but deep down, in a place she did not yet have words for, she knew it wasn't. She returned to her small room that night, but sleep did not come easily. She lay on her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment in the courtyard again and again, trying to understand what she had felt when she stood beside the statue. It had not been fear, not exactly. It had been something closer to recognition, as if some part of her had been waiting her whole life for that single moment, without ever knowing it. Outside her window, the castle was quiet, the kind of quiet that came only in the deepest hours of the night, when even the guards moved slower and spoke softer. Illyra closed her eyes and tried to push away the questions crowding her mind. Questions about who she was, where she came from, and why an ancient guardian bound in stone for 400 years had chosen this night, of all nights, to stir. She did not know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that in the courtyard below, the statue's stone eyes remained open, just a little wider than they had been an hour before, as if something ancient and patient had finally begun to wake, and had chosen, after 4 centuries of silence, to watch over the girl who had unknowingly called it back to life. Morning came too quickly. Illyra woke before the sun had fully risen, her body stiff from a night of restless half-sleep, her mind still tangled in the memory of glowing stone and open eyes. For a moment, lying in the gray light filtering through her small window, she almost convinced herself the entire night had been a dream, some strange trick of exhaustion after a long day of chores. Then she heard the voices outside her door. 2 guards stood in the narrow hallway, their conversation low but not quiet enough to hide from her. She caught fragments as she dressed, words like unnatural and impossible, and one phrase that made her stomach twist. "The king has not slept." She stepped into the hallway, and both guards fell silent, watching her with the same wary expression Callum had worn the night before. It was strange, she thought, how quickly people could look at someone differently. Yesterday she had been invisible, a servant girl no one noticed unless a task needed doing. Today she was something else entirely, though no one, including herself, seemed to know exactly what. She was brought to the courtyard just as the sun cleared the eastern wall, its early light spilling gold across the stone paths. A small crowd had gathered at a careful distance, servants and guards alike, whispering among themselves as they watched her approach the statue with Rowan at her side. Cassian was already there, standing near the base of the statue, his dark coat replaced by something simpler, though no less commanding. He looked as though he had not slept, exactly as the guards had said, dark shadows beneath his sharp gray eyes, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that came from a mind working too hard through too many hours of the night. "You're certain about this?" Rowan asked him quietly, though Illyra was close enough to hear. "I am certain of nothing," Cassian said. "That is precisely the problem." He turned to Illyra as she stopped a few feet from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The statue stood between them, its stone surface cool and gray in the morning light, showing no trace of the glow from the night before. Illyra almost wondered if she had imagined the whole thing, if her tired mind had conjured something out of nothing. "Walk toward it," Cassian said, slowly. "Tell me everything you feel, no matter how small." Illyra glanced at the crowd gathered near the courtyard entrance, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her, and swallowed hard before stepping forward. Her heart pounded with each step, though she could not have said whether it was fear or something else entirely. The closer she came to the statue, the more aware she became of a low warmth spreading through her chest, faint at first, then stronger, like standing near a fire she could not see. "I feel warm," she said softly, "like something is waking up." "Keep going," Cassian said. She took another step, and another, until she stood directly beside the statue's raised paw, close enough to see the fine details carved into the stone, the texture of fur frozen in place for 400 years, the curve of powerful shoulders captured mid-stride. Up close, the wolf looked less like a decoration, and more like a living creature that had simply stopped moving, waiting patiently for something to call it back. The warmth in her chest grew stronger, spreading down her arms, and without meaning to, she reached out and rested her fingers lightly against the stone. The reaction was immediate. Light burst from beneath her hand, spreading in thin golden veins across the statue's entire body, brighter than it had been the night before. The crowd gasped and stepped back. Somewhere behind her, she heard Rowan draw his sword halfway from its sheath before Cassian raised a hand, silently ordering him to stand down. Alira wanted to pull her hand away, but found she couldn't, as though the stone itself had gently closed around her fingers, holding her in place. It didn't hurt. If anything, it felt oddly comforting, like a hand she had been reaching for her entire life had finally found hers in return. "Elira," Cassian said, his voice tight with something she couldn't quite name, "step back." "I can't," she said, panic creeping into her voice for the first time. "I don't know how." The light climbed higher, tracing over the statue's lowered head, and for the briefest moment, Elira could have sworn she saw the stone eyes blink, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a jolt of fear straight through her heart. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the light dimmed, retreating back into the stone until only a faint golden shimmer remained along the edges of the statue's paw, right where her hand still rested. The moment the light faded, her fingers slipped free, and she stumbled back a step, breathing hard, her whole body trembling. Cassian was at her side almost instantly, one hand steadying her shoulder before he seemed to catch himself and pulled it back, as if remembering, too late, that a king did not touch a servant so freely. Alira barely noticed. Her mind was still spinning from what she had seen, what she had felt, the strange certainty that something ancient and aware had reached back toward her through centuries of silence. "What was that?" she whispered. "I don't know," Cassian admitted, and something about his honesty, spoken quietly enough that only she could hear, eased some of the fear tightening her chest. "But I intend to find out." He ordered the courtyard cleared, and within minutes, the crowd had scattered, whispering among themselves as they returned to their duties, though Elira could feel their curious glances following her, long after they had gone. Rowan remained nearby, along with 2 other guards, but Cassian dismissed them as well, asking only Eldon, the elderly historian, to join them. Eldon arrived within the hour, moving slower than the urgency of the situation demanded, his arms full of books that looked older than the castle itself. He set them down carefully on a stone bench near the statue and began flipping through brittle pages, muttering to himself as he searched for something specific. "There," he said finally, tapping a page covered in faded handwriting. "Here it is. The full account of the first sealing." Cassian leaned over his shoulder to read, and Alira, curiosity overpowering her exhaustion, moved closer as well. "The first Alpha King," Eldon explained, "bound the Guardian into stone, not as punishment, but as protection. The kingdom was at war then, torn between human settlements and shifting pacts, blood spilled on both sides for reasons long forgotten. The Guardian, according to this account, was created to maintain balance between the two peoples, a bridge rather than a weapon. But balance, it seems, was not what those in power wanted." "What happened to it?" Alira asked. "The Guardian was betrayed," Eldon said, his voice growing quieter. "Sealed into stone by those who feared its power more than they valued its purpose. The first Alpha King, torn by guilt, could not undo the sealing, but he vowed the Guardian would wake again, one day, when the balance it once protected returned to the kingdom." Alira felt a strange tightness in her chest as she listened, though she couldn't explain why the story felt so personal, so close to something she couldn't quite remember. "And you believe I have something to do with this," she said slowly. "I believe," Eldon said, closing the book gently, "that 400 years of silence do not break themselves. Something changed the moment you arrived in this courtyard. Whether that something is you, specifically, or simply the presence of someone the Guardian recognizes, I cannot yet say. Cassian had remained quiet throughout the explanation, his eyes fixed on the statue as though searching for answers written somewhere in the stone itself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Elira hadn't heard from him before, something closer to uncertainty than command. If this prophecy is true, he said, then everything my family has believed about our purpose, about the balance we were meant to protect, may have been wrong for 400 years. Or, Eldon offered gently, perhaps it has simply been waiting. Elira looked between the two men, feeling suddenly out of place in a conversation about prophecies and ancient guardians, about kingdoms and bloodlines far beyond anything she had ever imagined for herself. She was a servant. She scrubbed floors and carried linens, and slept in a room barely large enough for a bed. She did not belong in stories about sacred wolves and broken balances. And yet, standing there in the morning light, her fingers still tingling faintly from where they had touched the stone, she could not deny that something inside her had responded to that statue in a way she had never felt before, not once, in all her years of being unwanted and unclaimed. "What do you want from me?" she asked Cassian directly, tired of being talked about as though she weren't standing right there. He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes steady, despite the uncertainty she had seen in them only moments before. "For now," he said, "I want you close, where I can understand what is happening, before anyone outside this castle learns of it. There are those who would see an awakening guardian as a weapon to be claimed, rather than a balance to be honored. And after that?" "After that," he said, "I suppose we will discover the truth together." It was not the answer she wanted, not really, but it was honest, and in a castle full of whispers and suspicious glances, honesty felt like something rare enough to hold on to. Elira nodded slowly, glancing once more at the statue beside them, its stone surface calm now, though she could have sworn, just for a moment, that the faint golden shimmer along its paw pulsed once, gently, like a heartbeat settling into rhythm. She did not know what role she was meant to play in a story that had begun 400 years before her birth, but for the first time in her life, someone was looking at her not as an orphan with no name and no history, but as someone who might matter, who might be part of something larger than the small, quiet world she had always known. It frightened her. It also, in a way she did not yet want to admit, gave her a strange and fragile kind of hope. 3 days passed, and Kaelmore Castle had not settled since the morning the statue answered Elira's touch. She could feel the change everywhere she went. Servants who once ignored her now watched her from doorways, falling silent when she passed. Guards who had never spoken a word to her now nodded respectfully, though their eyes carried more suspicion than respect. Even Marta, the old cook who had scolded her 100 times over the years, now handed her meals without a word, her expression unreadable. Elira had been moved from her small storage room to a proper chamber near the eastern wing, closer to the family quarters than any servant had ever been allowed. She understood why. Cassian wanted her close, wanted to keep watch over whatever she was becoming, though even he did not seem to know what that meant. She sat by the window of her new room on the third evening, looking out over the darkening courtyard, when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Cassian standing there, alone, without Rowan or any of his usual guards trailing behind him. It was the first time she had seen him without an audience, and something about his presence felt different without the weight of his court watching. "May I come in?" he asked, and the question surprised her enough that she stepped aside without answering, allowing him to enter. He looked around the room briefly, taking in its simple furnishings, before turning his attention back to her. "I wanted to ask you something," he said, without Eldon's books or Rowan's suspicion clouding the conversation. "Ask me what?" "What do you remember," he said, "of your life before the castle? Anything at all, no matter how small." Elira hesitated. It was not a question she was often asked, and never one she had answered honestly to anyone. "Nothing," she admitted. "I was found as an infant near the northern border. The merchants who found me said there was no sign of anyone else, no camp, no tracks, nothing to explain how a baby ended up alone on a mountain path in the middle of winter. No belongings? No markings? Only the cloth I was wrapped in," she said. "Gray wool, plain, Nothing special. I still have it, actually. I never had a reason to throw it away. Something shifted in Cassian's expression. A flicker of interest he tried, and failed, to hide. Would you show me? She retrieved the small folded cloth from the bottom of her trunk, worn thin with age, and handed it to him carefully. He unfolded it with a gentleness she hadn't expected from someone so guarded, examining the fabric closely under the lantern light. This weave, he said slowly, is not common cloth. It's mountain wool, spun in a pattern used only in the northern settlements, the ones closest to the border, where the old peacekeeping clans once lived, before the war scattered them. What does that mean? It means, Cassian said, folding the cloth back carefully and handing it to her, that whoever left you on that path was not simply passing through. They were from a place tied directly to the history Eldon described. A place connected to the balance the Guardian was created to protect. Alira sat down slowly on the edge of her bed, the cloth clutched tightly in her hands. I always thought I had nothing, she said quietly. No family, no history, nothing to explain who I was or where I came from. And now you're telling me I might be connected to some ancient bloodline no one has spoken of in centuries. I am telling you, Cassian said carefully, that it is possible. Nothing more. Not yet. It's more than I've ever known, she said, and to her own surprise, her voice cracked slightly on the words. She had spent her entire life believing she belonged to no one, that she had been left behind because she was unwanted, unworthy of being claimed. The idea that her past might hold a purpose, might connect her to something larger than her own quiet existence, was almost too much to hold steady in her chest. Cassian was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that had softened considerably from the guarded distance he usually kept. I know what it is to carry a weight you never asked for, he said finally. I was raised knowing I would inherit, not just a throne, but a promise, made 400 years ago. One I never fully understood, until a few days ago. I understand, perhaps better than most, what it feels like, to discover your life, has always been part of something larger. Is that supposed to comfort me? No, he admitted, and something close to a small smile touched the corner of his mouth. I suppose it isn't very comforting at all. Despite herself, Alira felt the tension in her chest ease slightly, and she almost smiled back before catching herself, remembering, suddenly, exactly who she was speaking to. A king, not a friend, not someone who owed her comfort or honesty, and yet here he was, offering both. Why are you telling me all of this? She asked. You could have kept this information to yourself, used it however you needed without explaining any of it to me. Because, Cassian said, his gray eyes steady on hers, you deserve to understand what is happening to your own life, regardless of what it means for my kingdom. It was such a simple statement, but it struck her harder than she expected, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with something neither seemed ready to name. The moment was broken by a sharp knock at the door. Rowan entered without waiting for permission, his expression tense in a way that immediately put both of them on alert. Forgive the interruption, he said, but we have received word from the border. Scouts from the Ashbrook Pack were spotted near our territory line, closer than they've come in years. Cassian's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The softness Alira had glimpsed only moments ago replaced by the sharp, controlled focus of a king preparing for trouble. How close? Close enough to have seen the courtyard, Rowan said grimly. Close enough, I fear, to have heard the stories already spreading through the villages. Alira felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. Who are the Ashbrook Pack? A rival territory, Cassian said, his jaw tight. Old enemies of Kael'mor, going back generations. If they've learned about the awakening, they will not sit quietly and wonder what it means. They will act. What kind of action? Cassian did not answer right away, and the silence stretched long enough that Alira understood the answer before he spoke it aloud. The kind that puts you in danger, he said finally. Which means, starting tonight, your safety is no longer a quiet matter kept within these walls. It is a concern for the entire kingdom. Alira's hands tightened around the folded gray cloth still resting in her lap, the only piece of a past she had never known, now suddenly tangled in a present far more dangerous than she had ever imagined for herself. Only days ago, her greatest worry had been finishing her chores before sundown. Now she sat in a room with a king and his captain, discussing rival pacts and ancient prophecies, as though her life had been rewritten overnight. In a way, she realized, it had been. "I'm not asking to be protected," she said, lifting her chin slightly, some stubborn part of her refusing to be treated as fragile, simply because the world around her had suddenly grown complicated. "But I would like to understand what I'm facing, instead of being kept in the dark while everyone else decides my fate for me." Cassian studied her for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his sharp gray eyes. "Very well," he said. "Tomorrow, you will join Eldon and me in the archive. If the Ashbrook pack is moving, we need to understand exactly what we are protecting, and why, before they arrive at our gates." Rowan looked as though he wanted to protest, but a single glance from Cassian silenced whatever objection he had been about to raise. He nodded instead, turning to leave, though his eyes lingered on Alira a moment longer, his expression unreadable. When the door closed behind him, Cassian remained a moment longer, his gaze drifting once more to the courtyard, visible through her window, where the statue stood silent and still beneath the rising moon. "Get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, I fear, will not be an easy day." "Was today?" she asked, a small, tired smile tugging at her lips despite everything. For the first time since she had met him, Cassian laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to catch him off guard, as much as it did her. "No," he admitted. "I suppose it wasn't." He left soon after, and Alira sat alone in the quiet of her new chamber, the gray cloth still resting in her hands, the weight of everything she had learned pressing gently against her thoughts. Outside her window, the statue stood watch over the courtyard as it always had, but now, knowing what she knew, it no longer looked like a silent decoration. It looked like it was waiting. And for the first time in her life, Alira understood, with a certainty she could not explain, that whatever was coming, she would not be waiting alone. Sleep did not come easily that night, and when it finally did, it carried Alira somewhere she had never been before. In the dream, she stood on a mountain path she did not recognize, snow falling silently around her, though she felt no cold. Ahead of her, a woman stood with her back turned, her long dark hair loose over a gray wool cloak, identical to the one Alira had kept her entire life. The woman did not turn around, no matter how many times Alira called out to her, her voice swallowed by the falling snow. She woke suddenly, her heart racing, the details of the dream already slipping away like water through her fingers, leaving behind only a faint, aching sense of loss for something she had never truly had. Morning brought with it a heaviness that had not been present the day before. Word of the Ashbrook scouts had spread quickly through the castle, and Alira could feel the tension in every hallway she walked, guards stationed at doors that had never needed watching before, servants speaking in hushed, worried tones. She met Cassian and Eldon in the archive as promised, the small circular room feeling even more crowded than before, with the weight of urgency pressing down on all of them. Eldon had gathered a new stack of books overnight, older and more fragile than the ones he had shown them previously, their leather covers cracked with age. "I searched further into the original records," Eldon explained, spreading several pages carefully across the desk. "There is more to the story than what I shared before." "Go on," Cassian said, his arms crossed, his expression tight with barely contained impatience. "The peacekeeping clans," Eldon continued, "the ones tied to the mountain wool your cloth was woven from, were not simply bystanders in the war that led to the Guardian's sealing. They were the ones who created the Guardian in the first place, through a bond formed between human and wolf, a bond meant to symbolize the unity the kingdom once had, before conflict tore it apart." Alira leaned forward, her earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new information. "You're saying humans created the Guardian, not the first Alpha King?" "The first Alpha King sealed the Guardian," Eldon clarified, "in an attempt to protect it from those who wished to use its power for war, rather than balance. But the Guardian's origin traces back to a partnership between his kingdom and the clans who lived at the mountain border, your people, if the cloth and the timing are to be believed." "My people," Alira repeated slowly, the words feeling foreign and strange in her mouth. She had spent her entire life believing she belonged to no one, and now she was being told she might belong to an entire clan, one tied directly to ancient magic and broken promises centuries old. "What happened to them?" she asked. "The clans, I mean. If they existed once, why haven't I ever heard of them?" Eldon's expression grew somber. The war scattered them, along with everyone else caught between human settlements and shifting packs. Most records suggest the clans retreated further into the mountains, away from conflict, away from the kingdoms that had once relied on their partnership. Over time, their existence faded into legend, until most believed they had died out entirely. But if they didn't, Cassian said slowly, understanding dawning in his sharp gray eyes, if even a few survived in isolation, hidden away from a world that had forgotten them, it would explain how a child could be found alone on a mountain path, with no trace of where she came from. Illyra sat back, her mind spinning with the implications. If Eldon was right, somewhere out there, hidden in the mountains beyond Kael'mor's borders, there might be others like her, people connected to a history she had never known existed, a family she had never known to search for. I need to know more, she said, her voice firmer than she expected. I need to know if they're still out there. That, Cassian said carefully, may not be possible right now, not with Ashbrook scouts already testing our borders. Any expedition north would be seen as provocation, and we cannot afford conflict on two fronts while the Guardian remains only partially awakened. Illyra understood the logic, even as frustration rose hot and sharp in her chest. For the first time in her life, she had a thread leading toward an answer to who she truly was, and circumstances beyond her control were pulling that thread just out of reach. Then what am I supposed to do? She asked. Sit here and wait while everyone else decides what happens next? You are supposed to survive, Cassian said, his voice quiet but firm, long enough for the truth to matter. If Ashbrook believes you are the key to reawakening a power capable of shifting the balance of every kingdom in this region, they will not hesitate to use force to claim you, or worse, to eliminate the possibility altogether. The blunt honesty of his words settled uncomfortably in Illyra's chest, but she appreciated it more than she would have appreciated false comfort. She had spent too many years being talked around, being handled carefully by people who assumed she couldn't understand the truth of her own circumstances. Cassian, at least, trusted her enough to be direct. Then teach me, she said suddenly, surprising even herself with the request. If I'm going to be caught in the middle of all this, I want to understand how to protect myself, not just wait behind castle walls hoping everyone else keeps me safe. Cassian studied her for a long moment, something like approval, flickering behind his guarded expression. That, he said, is not an unreasonable request. You would train her? Rowan asked from the doorway, having entered sometime during the conversation, without either of them noticing. His tone carried clear skepticism. She's human, untrained. It would take months before she could defend herself against a shifter with any real skill. Then we start today, Cassian said simply, and we work with whatever time we have. Illyra felt a flicker of something unfamiliar rise in her chest, something that felt almost like determination, sharpened by weeks of feeling powerless over her own circumstances. She had spent her whole life accepting whatever role others assigned her. Servant, orphan, nobody of consequence. For the first time, she had the chance to become something more, not through some mystical prophecy, but through her own effort and choice. All right, she said, meeting Cassian's gaze steadily. Where do we start? Training began that very afternoon, in a private courtyard, away from curious eyes, Cassian himself overseeing her first lessons in basic defense, how to move, how to read an opponent's balance, how to use speed and awareness, rather than brute strength she simply did not possess. It was exhausting work, her muscles aching in places she hadn't known could ache, but she pushed through it with a stubbornness that seemed to genuinely surprise him. You don't quit easily, he observed, watching her catch her breath after a particularly difficult drill, sweat clinging to her forehead despite the cool evening air. I've never had the luxury of quitting, she said between breaths. When you have nothing, giving up just means you have less than nothing. Something in his expression shifted at that, a flash of understanding that went deeper than simple sympathy. I misjudged you, he admitted quietly. When Rowan first brought you to me, I assumed you were simply caught in circumstances beyond your understanding, someone who would need protecting, rather than someone capable of standing on her own. And now? Now, he said, I think underestimating you may prove to be the greater mistake. The compliment, simple as it was, warmed something in her chest she hadn't expected, and for a moment, Standing in the fading evening light with her muscles sore and her breath still catching, Alira allowed herself to feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, something dangerously close to belonging. That feeling did not last long. A shout rang out from the castle walls just as the sun dipped below the horizon, followed quickly by the sound of a warning bell echoing across the courtyards. Cassian's entire posture changed instantly, the brief warmth between them replaced by sharp, immediate focus. "Stay close to me," he said, already moving toward the sound. They reached the main wall to find Rowan and several guards gathered near the gate, staring out into the darkening tree line beyond the castle grounds. Torches flickered in the distance, too many to be a simple patrol, arranged in a formation that spoke clearly of intent rather than accident. "Ashbrook," Rowan said grimly, confirming what Alira had already feared. "They're not testing the border anymore, my lord. They're announcing themselves." Cassian's jaw tightened as he studied the distant torchlight, his expression hardening into something colder and more calculating than Alira had seen from him before. "How many?" "Enough to make a statement," Rowan said. "Not enough, I think, for an actual attack." "Not yet." "Then what do they want?" Alira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer before anyone spoke it aloud. Cassian turned to look at her, his gray eyes steady, despite the tension radiating from every line of his body. "They want to know if the rumors are true," he said. "They want to see, with their own eyes, whether the sacred wolf has truly begun to wake, and whether the girl standing beside their old enemy is the reason why." The torches in the distance flickered against the darkening sky, patient and watchful, and Alira felt, for the first time since the statue had first responded to her presence, the true weight of what she had unknowingly stepped into. This was no longer simply a mystery to solve within the safety of castle walls. It had become a war waiting to begin, and she stood, whether she wanted to or not, directly at its center. No attack came that night, though few in the castle slept peacefully. The Ashbrook torches remained at the tree line until just before dawn, then vanished as silently as they had appeared, leaving behind nothing but disturbed nerves and unanswered questions. Alira spent the following days caught between two entirely different lives. By morning, she trained with Cassian in the private courtyard, her body slowly growing stronger, more capable, her movements less clumsy with each passing session. By afternoon, she sat with Eldon in the archive, poring over fragile pages and half-forgotten records, searching for any mention of the mountain clans, any thread that might lead her closer to understanding who she truly was. It was during one of these afternoon sessions that Eldon made a discovery that changed everything. "Here," he said, sliding a brittle page across the desk toward her, his voice tight with barely contained excitement. "A record from nearly 200 years ago. A border patrol reported encountering a small settlement deep in the northern mountains, isolated, self-sufficient, its people wary of outsiders but not hostile." Alira leaned forward, scanning the faded handwriting carefully. "Did they identify who lived there?" "The patrol described them as descendants of the old peacekeeping clans," Eldon said, "still practicing traditions tied to balance between human and wolf, still weaving cloth in the same pattern as the one you carry. The settlement was called Thorn Hollow." 200 years is a long time," Alira said carefully, not wanting to let herself hope too much, though her heart had already begun to race. "They might not still be there." "They might not," Eldon agreed, "but it's the first solid thread we've found. And threads, however thin, are worth following." Cassian, who had joined them partway through the discussion, remained quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "If Thorn Hollow still exists," he said finally, "and if its people are indeed connected to the Guardian's origin, they may hold answers we cannot find in any archive. Answers about the prophecy, about what full awakening requires, and perhaps, about the danger Ashbrook now poses." "You're considering sending someone north," Alira said, reading the calculation behind his words. "I'm considering going myself," he corrected, "though Rowan will undoubtedly argue against it." "He'd be right to," Alira said. "You're the king. You can't simply leave the castle undefended, with Ashbrook watching our borders." "No," Cassian agreed, "which is why I need to think carefully about who I trust to lead such an expedition in my place." His eyes settled on her as he spoke, and Alira understood immediately what he was suggesting, even before he said it aloud. "You want to send me," she said. "I want to ask you," he corrected gently. whether you would be willing to go, alongside a small, trusted escort. No one has more reason to seek out Thorn Hollow than you do, and if the settlement's people recognize the cloth, recognize whatever connection exists between you and their history, they may trust you in ways they would never trust a stranger from Kael'mor. The idea terrified her, and thrilled her in equal measure. For her entire life, she had dreamed, quietly and without much hope, of discovering where she truly came from. Now that possibility stood directly in front of her, close enough to reach, though wrapped in danger she couldn't fully predict. "I'll go," she said, before she could talk herself out of it. "You should think it over," Cassian said, though something in his tone suggested he had expected exactly this answer. "I don't need to think it over," Elira said firmly. "I've spent my entire life not knowing who I am. If there's even a small chance Thorn Hollow can answer that, I'm not going to let fear stop me from finding out." Rowan, predictably, argued fiercely against the plan, when Cassian informed him that evening, insisting the mountains were too dangerous, the timing too uncertain, with Ashbrook still testing the borders, the risk to Elira too great, given how little training she had received. But Cassian remained firm, and eventually, Rowan relented, agreeing to lead the escort himself, along with 2 additional guards he trusted completely. They departed 3 days later, before the sun had fully risen, moving quietly through the castle gates, to avoid drawing attention from any watching eyes. Cassian remained behind, as duty demanded, though Elira could see the reluctance in his expression as he said goodbye at the gate, his usual composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "Be careful," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Whatever you find in those mountains, come back to me." The words settled somewhere deep in her chest, warm and unexpected, and she found herself unable to answer with anything more than a small, determined nod, before turning to follow Rowan into the early morning fog. The journey north took 4 days, the terrain growing steadily rougher as they climbed higher into the mountains, the air thinning and cooling with each passing mile. Elira found herself grateful for the training sessions with Cassian, her body handling the difficult terrain far better than it would have only weeks before. On the evening of the 4th day, as the sun began to set behind jagged peaks, Rowan raised a hand, signaling the group to stop. "Smoke," he said quietly, nodding toward a thin gray trail rising from somewhere beyond the next ridge. "Someone's fire, and recent." They approached carefully, and as they crested the ridge, Elira's breath caught in her throat. Below them, nestled in a hidden valley, protected on all sides by steep mountain walls, stood a small settlement of wooden homes, smoke rising from several chimneys, figures moving between buildings as evening chores wound down for the day. It was smaller than she had imagined, no more than 30 or 40 structures, but it was undeniably real, undeniably alive. Thorn Hollow existed. "How do we approach?" one of the guards asked quietly. Eldon said they were wary of outsiders. "We don't approach as outsiders," Elira said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. She reached into her cloak and pulled free the gray woolen cloth she had carried her entire life, holding it carefully as she began the descent toward the valley below. They were spotted before reaching the settlement's edge, several armed figures emerging from between the wooden homes, their expressions guarded, their weapons raised but not yet threatening. Elira stopped several paces away, raising the gray cloth for them to see. "My name is Elira," she called out, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I was found as an infant near the border, wrapped in this cloth. I've come seeking answers about where I came from." The armed figures exchanged uncertain glances, and for a long moment, no one spoke. Then, from among the gathered villagers, an older woman stepped forward, her expression shifting from wariness to something far more complicated, as her eyes settled on the cloth in Elira's hands. "That weave," the woman said slowly, her voice trembling slightly, "belongs to the Hollowmere family line. It has not been used in nearly 20 years. "Do you know them?" Elira asked, hope and fear tangled together so tightly in her chest she could barely breathe. "Do you know who they were?" The woman's eyes filled with tears as she studied Elira's face carefully, searching for something Elira couldn't begin to guess at, until finally, she nodded slowly, her voice breaking on her next words. "I knew her mother," she said. "Mira Hollowmere. She disappeared into the storm 18 years ago, carrying a newborn daughter she refused to leave behind, fleeing an attack none of us ever fully understood. We searched for weeks. We found nothing. We assumed you had both perished in the mountains." Elira felt the ground shift beneath her, though she hadn't moved at all. 18 years of silence, of not knowing, of believing she belonged to no one, collapsing in the span of a single sentence. "My mother," she whispered. "She had a name. Mira." "She did," the older woman said gently, stepping closer, reaching out to touch Elira's face with trembling, careful hands, as though afraid she might disappear if held too tightly. "And you, child, have her eyes." For the first time in her entire life, standing in a hidden valley among strangers who somehow already knew pieces of a story she had spent years trying to uncover, Elira allowed herself to cry, not from fear or exhaustion, but from something far more overwhelming. She had a name to attach to her past. She had, finally, after 18 years of silence, the beginning of an answer to who she truly was. The woman introduced herself as Sable, the eldest healer of Thornhollow, and she led Elira and her small escort into the settlement with a gentleness that felt like a balm against years of unanswered questions. Word spread quickly among the villagers, and by the time they reached Sable's home near the center of the valley, a small crowd had gathered, watching Elira, with expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open wonder. "Sit," Sable said, guiding Elira toward a wooden chair near a modest hearth. "You've traveled far, and there is much to explain." Rowan and the guards remained near the doorway, alert but not interfering, while Sable prepared a simple meal, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades caring for others. Elira accepted the offered food gratefully, though her mind remained too full of questions to fully focus on eating. "Tell me about her," Elira said quietly. "About my mother." Sable's expression grew distant, memory pulling her gaze toward the fire. "Mira was one of the strongest among us," she said. "Not in body, though she was capable enough, but in spirit. She believed deeply in the old ways, in the balance our clan had protected for generations, long after most of the outside world had forgotten we existed at all." "What balance?" Elira asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer, given everything Eldon had uncovered in the archive. "The bond between human and wolf," Sable said. "Our clan's ancestors helped create the guardian your Alpha King's people speak of, centuries ago, when human settlements and shifting packs still worked together rather than apart. We were never warriors, we were peacekeepers, healers, the quiet thread holding two very different peoples together. And the guardian was sealed," Elira said, "because someone feared that balance." Sable nodded slowly. "There were those, even then, who believed peace was weakness, who wanted a weapon rather than a bridge. When they moved against the guardian, our ancestors fought to protect it. But the fighting scattered our people across these mountains, hiding what remained of the clan, far from a world that no longer understood what we stood for." "And my mother," Elira pressed gently. "Why did she flee 18 years ago? What was she running from?" Sable's expression darkened, and for a long moment, she said nothing, staring into the flickering hearth, as though gathering the strength to continue. "There were rumors," she said finally, "that a faction outside our clan had learned of the old bloodlines still surviving in these mountains. Bloodlines connected directly to the Guardian's original binding. They believed that if such a bloodline could be found and controlled, they could force the Guardian's power to serve them, rather than protect the balance it was created for." Elira's stomach tightened with dread. "Ashbrook," she said quietly, more statement than question. Sable's eyes widened slightly. "You know of them?" "They're testing Kael'mor's borders even now," Elira said. "They know the Guardian has begun to wake. If they learn about Thornhollow, about the truth of my bloodline, they won't hesitate to come here." The weight of that realization settled heavily over the room, and Rowan stepped forward from the doorway, his expression grim. "We need to move quickly," he said. "If Ashbrook discovers this settlement's location, they will not care about the innocent lives caught in the crossfire." "He's right," Sable said, rising from her seat with sudden urgency. "You must return to Kael'mor, and you must warn your people. But first, there is something you need to see, something your mother left behind, should you ever find your way back here." She led Elira to a small wooden chest hidden beneath the floorboards of her home, its surface worn smooth with age. Inside, wrapped carefully in cloth identical to the one Elira had carried her entire life, lay a collection of old letters and a single piece of jewelry, a simple silver pendant shaped like a wolf's paw, its edges worn from years of handling. "Your mother left these with me," Sable explained, "the night before she fled with you into the storm. She said if anything happened to her, and if you ever returned, I was to give these to you, along with a message she made me memorize, word for word." "What was the message?" Alira asked, her hands trembling as she accepted the pendant, feeling its cool weight settle against her palm. Sable's eyes softened with old grief. She said, "Tell my daughter the balance was always meant to be protected, not by power, but by love freely given. Tell her that wherever she ends up, whoever she becomes, she carries within her the same choice every guardian and every clan before her has faced. To protect what matters, not through force, but through the courage to stand beside it, no matter the cost." Alira closed her fingers around the pendant, tears blurring her vision as she absorbed words her mother had spoken nearly 2 decades before her daughter was old enough to understand them. It felt, in some strange and profound way, like receiving a message meant exactly for this moment, for the choice she now faced regarding the guardian, the prophecy, and the kingdom that had unexpectedly become her responsibility to protect. "I need to return to Kael'mor," she said, rising to her feet with new determination. "Ashbrook is already moving, and if they learn about Thornhollow, this entire settlement will be in danger." "Then let us return with you," Sable said suddenly, surprising everyone in the room. "Our people have hidden for too long, waiting for a threat that has finally arrived at our door regardless of our silence. If the Guardian is truly waking, if the balance our ancestors protected is finally being restored, then perhaps it is time Thornhollow stopped hiding and started standing beside Kael'mor instead." The offer hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rowan looked skeptical, clearly uncertain about bringing an entire hidden settlement into direct conflict with Ashbrook, but Alira understood immediately what Sable was offering. Not just aid, but reconnection, the beginning of healing a divide that had lasted 400 years. "Are you certain?" Alira asked. "This could put your people directly in harm's way." "We have hidden in these mountains for generations," Sable said, believing safety meant separation. But separation did not protect Mira. It did not protect you from growing up without a family who loved you. Perhaps it is time we understood that true safety comes not from hiding, but from standing together with those who share our purpose. Alira felt something powerful settle in her chest, a resolve she had never quite felt before, sharpened by grief for a mother she had never known, and strengthened by the unexpected kindness of people who had welcomed her without hesitation. She was no longer simply searching for answers about her past. She was beginning to understand her role in shaping what came next. They departed Thornhollow 2 days later, a larger group than the one that had arrived, Sable and a dozen able-bodied clan members joining Rowan's escort for the journey back to Kael'mor. The mountain path felt different on the return trip, less like an uncertain search and more like the beginning of something Alira could not yet fully name, but felt, with growing certainty, was exactly where she was meant to be. As they crested the final ridge before Kael'mor came into view, smoke rising faintly from its distant towers, Alira paused, looking back one final time toward the mountains that had, however briefly, given her a piece of the family she had spent her entire life searching for. She carried her mother's pendant now, resting warm against her chest, alongside the gray cloth that had once been her only connection to a past she never understood. She carried, too, a message meant to guide her through whatever challenges still lay ahead, a reminder that whatever power the Guardian held, whatever destiny the prophecy suggested, the true strength required to face it would come not from ancient magic alone, but from the simple, unwavering choice to protect what mattered, no matter the cost. Ahead of her, Kael'mor waited, and with it, Cassian, the Guardian, and a growing storm neither of them could avoid much longer. She quickened her pace, ready, for the first time in her life, to face whatever came next, not as an orphan with no history, but as Alira Hollowmere, daughter of Mira, carrying within her the same courage that had once protected an entire kingdom's fragile balance. Kael'mor's gates opened wide as the returning group approached, word having traveled ahead that Rowan's escort had arrived safely, along with unexpected guests from the northern mountains. Cassian was waiting in the courtyard when they entered, and the moment his eyes found Alira, something in his rigid posture eased, relief flooding through his carefully maintained composure. before he caught himself, remembering the many eyes watching his every reaction. "You're safe," he said, closing the distance between them quickly, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "I feared the worst, when the days stretched longer than expected." "I found more than I ever hoped to find," Illyra said, and something in her expression must have conveyed the weight of everything that had happened, because his gaze softened further, searching her face carefully. "Tell me everything," he said, "but first, introduce me to our guests." Sable stepped forward, inclining her head respectfully toward the king, though her eyes carried the wariness of someone meeting, for the first time, a ruler whose ancestors had once been connected to her own clan's painful history. "Alpha King Cassian," she said, "I am Sable, Elder of Thornhollow. We have come to offer whatever assistance our people can provide, given the danger now facing both our communities." Cassian studied her for a long moment, before inclining his head in return, a gesture of respect Illyra had rarely seen him offer to anyone outside his own court. "Your people have my gratitude," he said, "and my apology, for 400 years of silence, that should never have separated us in the first place." The formal exchange settled something in the tense atmosphere of the courtyard, and Cassian quickly ordered quarters prepared for the Thornhollow arrivals, before pulling Illyra aside, along with Rowan and Eldon, toward the privacy of the throne room. There, over the following hour, Illyra recounted everything: her mother's name, the truth about the Guardian's origin, the warning about Ashbrook's ambitions, and finally, the message her mother had left behind. Cassian listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the full scope of the danger became clear. "If Ashbrook believes controlling your bloodline means controlling the Guardian's power," he said finally, "they will not simply continue testing our borders. They will move directly against you, and against anyone connected to Thornhollow. Then we need to be ready before they do," Illyra said firmly. "Ready how?" Rowan asked. "We still don't fully understand what full awakening requires, or what the Guardian is even capable of once restored." All eyes turned to Eldon, who had remained quiet throughout most of the conversation, his expression thoughtful as he considered the question. "The old records suggest," he said slowly, "that full awakening requires more than simple proximity or touch. It requires an act of genuine sacrifice, freely given, mirroring the very balance the Guardian was created to protect." "What kind of sacrifice?" Illyra asked, a knot of unease forming in her stomach. "I don't know precisely," Eldon admitted. "The records are frustratingly vague on this point, though they consistently emphasize that the sacrifice must come from a place of genuine choice, not coercion. Whatever it requires, it cannot be forced or manipulated into happening." Cassian's jaw tightened, which means, if Ashbrook does capture Illyra, believing they can force the Guardian's power through her, they will fail regardless of what they attempt. "That is likely true," Eldon said, "though I doubt that knowledge will stop them from trying, or from causing significant harm in the attempt." The conversation continued late into the evening, strategies discussed and discarded, defensive preparations ordered throughout the castle and surrounding villages. By the time Illyra finally retired to her chamber, exhaustion had settled deep into her bones, though sleep still felt impossibly far away, her mind racing with everything that had happened over the past week. A soft knock interrupted her restless thoughts sometime near midnight. She opened the door to find Cassian standing there, his usual composure replaced by something more vulnerable, more uncertain than she had ever seen from him. "I couldn't sleep either," he admitted, before she could ask why he had come. She stepped aside, allowing him entry, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid hanging heavy in the quiet room. "I was afraid," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it, "when you were gone longer than expected. Not simply afraid for the kingdom, or for the prophecy, or for anything tied to duty. I was afraid, purely and selfishly, of losing you." Illyra's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding hard against her ribs. "Cassian. I know it's complicated," he continued, before she could find the right words to respond. "I know you carry a legacy now that connects you to something far larger than either of us fully understands. I know duty, and prophecy, and danger surround everything happening between us. But standing in that courtyard today, watching you return safely, I understood something I've been trying to deny since the moment the statue first responded to your presence. What did you understand? She asked softly. That whatever destiny the prophecy suggests, he said, stepping closer, his gray eyes steady and open in a way she had never seen from him before. I do not simply see you as the key to some ancient balance. I see you, Alira Hollowmere, exactly as you are. Stubborn and brave, and far stronger than anyone gave you credit for during all those years you spent unseen in this castle. And somewhere during these past weeks, without meaning to, I fell in love with exactly that person. The confession hung in the air between them, fragile and honest, and Alira felt something long guarded within her chest finally begin to loosen. Years of believing herself unwanted and unworthy of love, slowly giving way beneath the weight of his sincerity. I've spent my entire life believing I belonged to no one, she said quietly, that I was simply an orphan the world forgot to claim. And now, in the span of a few short weeks, I've discovered a mother who loved me enough to risk everything protecting me, a clan willing to stand beside people who once wronged them, and a king who somehow sees me as more than the destiny everyone keeps insisting I carry. You are more than that destiny, Cassian said firmly. Whatever the prophecy requires, whatever the Guardian ultimately needs from you, none of that changes who you are underneath it. That is the person I have come to care for, deeply and completely. Alira closed the remaining distance between them, and for the first time since arriving at Kael'mor Castle, as a frightened orphan, with nothing to her name, she allowed herself to simply exist in a moment, untouched by fear or duty or ancient prophecy, held instead by the quiet certainty of being genuinely seen and genuinely cared for. Outside her window, beneath the pale light of a rising moon, the statue in the courtyard stood silent and still, though the faint golden shimmer along its stone paw pulsed gently, steadily, as though responding, in its own ancient way, to the growing bond forming between the Guardian's chosen and the kingdom's king. Neither of them noticed the shimmer that night. They were too caught up in discovering, for the first time, what it truly felt like to be understood. But far beyond Kael'mor's walls, in the shadowed forests bordering Ashbrook territory, others had already begun moving, their plans set carefully into motion, waiting only for the right moment to strike against a kingdom they believed too distracted by love and prophecy to notice the danger closing in around them. The attack came 5 nights later, under cover of a storm that rolled in from the northern mountains, with a violence that felt almost deliberate, as though the sky itself sensed the danger approaching. Alira woke to the sound of alarm bells ringing across the castle, their urgent clanging cutting through the roar of wind and rain battering against her window. She dressed quickly, her hands steady, despite the fear tightening her chest. Months of training with Cassian, settling into instinct, as she grabbed the small blade he had gifted her during one of their sessions, and hurried into the hallway. Rowan met her halfway to the main hall, his expression grim, rain already soaking through his clothes from wherever he had come from. Ashbrook has breached the eastern wall, he said without preamble. They came through the storm, using the weather to mask their approach. Cassian is already at the front lines. Take me to him, Alira said immediately. He specifically ordered you kept safe in the inner chambers, Rowan said, though his tone carried little conviction, as though he already knew the argument was pointless. I'm not hiding while Kael'mor burns, Alira said firmly. Not after everything Thornhollow sacrificed to help us prepare for this. Take me to him, or I'll find my own way there. Rowan studied her for a long moment, before nodding reluctantly, leading her quickly through chaotic hallways filled with guards, rushing toward the eastern defenses. Servants ushering frightened children toward safer inner rooms, the entire castle alive with the frantic energy of a kingdom under siege. They found Cassian near the eastern courtyard, directing his forces with the sharp, controlled authority Alira had come to associate with him, though worry flickered behind his gray eyes the moment he spotted her approaching through the rain. You should be safe inside, he said, though he made no move to force her back. I trained for this, she said. Let me help. Before he could respond, a horn sounded from beyond the breached wall, deep and resonant, cutting through the storm with unmistakable purpose. Moments later, a figure emerged from the chaos, flanked by several Ashbrook warriors, his posture radiating the same commanding presence Alira recognized from Cassian himself, though twisted into something colder, more calculating. Alpha King Daemon of Ashbrook, Cassian said quietly, positioning himself protectively between Alira and the approaching figure. I wondered when you would finally show yourself instead of hiding behind scouts and shadows. Damon's cold eyes swept over the gathered Kael'mor forces before settling, with unsettling precision, directly on Alira. So the rumors are true, he said, his voice carrying easily across the storm-soaked courtyard. The lost bloodline has finally surfaced, right here in your castle, Cassian. How convenient for you. She is not a weapon for either of us to claim, Cassian said firmly. The Guardian was never meant to serve conquest. It was meant to protect balance. Balance, Damon repeated, something like contempt coloring the word. A pretty notion for a kingdom that has grown fat and comfortable behind its walls. Ashbrook has watched Kael'mor's prosperity for generations, while our own people struggled at the borders you refuse to share. If that Guardian's power can finally shift the scales in our favor, I will not hesitate to claim it, regardless of what ancient promises your ancestors made. The Guardian cannot be forced, Alira said, stepping forward despite Cassian's instinctive movement to keep her behind him. Its power responds only to genuine sacrifice, freely given. You cannot simply seize what isn't meant to be claimed through force. Damon's gaze sharpened on her, something calculating flickering behind his cold expression. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect a king's willingness to sacrifice everything for someone he loves might prove a rather convenient test of that theory. Before anyone could react, Damon gave a sharp signal, and several Ashbrook warriors surged forward, not toward Cassian's main defensive line, but directly toward Alira herself, clearly having planned this exact maneuver in advance. Cassian moved instantly, shifting into his wolf form with a speed that blurred the space between human and beast, meeting the attackers head-on with fierce, protective fury. Rowan and the nearby guards joined the fight immediately, the courtyard erupting into chaos as steel met claw, rain mixing with the sounds of combat echoing off ancient stone walls. Alira fought as she had trained, her small blade finding purchase against an opponent who had underestimated her lack of size, though she could feel herself being slowly separated from Cassian's protective presence as the battle intensified around them. A sharp pain exploded across her shoulder as one of the warriors managed to land a glancing blow, and she stumbled back, blood mixing with rainwater, as she pressed a hand against the wound, gritting her teeth against the sharp sting. Alira, Cassian's voice cut through the chaos, raw with fear, as he fought desperately to reach her through the press of bodies separating them. She saw him then, wolf form powerful and fierce, tearing through Ashbrook warriors with a ferocity born entirely of desperation to reach her side, and something in that moment, watching him fight so completely, without regard for his own safety, struck her with sudden, undeniable clarity. This was the sacrifice the prophecy had spoken of, not some grand, singular act performed once and forgotten, but the continuous, unwavering choice to protect what mattered, regardless of personal cost. Her mother had made that choice 18 years ago, fleeing into a deadly storm rather than abandon her daughter. Cassian was making that same choice now, fighting through impossible odds without hesitation, driven purely by love rather than duty or prophecy. And Alira understood, with sudden and complete certainty, that she needed to make that same choice herself. She pushed through the chaos toward the courtyard's center, toward the statue standing silent amid the storm, and pressed both hands firmly against its cold stone surface, closing her eyes, as she poured every ounce of genuine feeling into the contact. Not fear. Not desperation to survive, but love, freely given, for a kingdom that had become her home, for a clan that had welcomed her without hesitation, for a king who had chosen to see her as more than any prophecy could define. The statue's response was immediate and overwhelming. Golden light exploded outward from beneath her hands, brighter than anything she had witnessed before, spreading rapidly across the entire courtyard, illuminating the storm-darkened battle with brilliant clarity. The stone beneath her palms began to crack, not violently, but gently, like an egg finally ready to release what had grown within it. And from within that breaking stone, a massive form began to emerge, ethereal and powerful, taking shape as a wolf, larger than any natural creature, its form composed of shimmering golden light rather than flesh and bone. The battle stopped instantly, every combatant frozen in stunned disbelief as the Guardian, fully awakened after 400 years of silent waiting, rose to its full height within the courtyard, its ancient presence radiating power that pressed against every witness like a physical force. Damon stumbled back, his earlier confidence shattering into open fear, as the Guardian's glowing eyes settled on him with unmistakable judgment. "You sought to claim through force," the Guardian said, its voice resonating with the weight of centuries. "What can only be given through genuine sacrifice. This balance was never yours to seize." With a single, powerful movement, the Guardian surged forward, not toward violence, but toward simple, overwhelming presence, forcing Damon and his remaining warriors back through the breached wall, with nothing more than the sheer weight of its ancient authority. Whatever courage had driven Ashbrook's assault crumbled entirely in the face of power they had never truly understood, and within minutes, the attacking forces retreated fully, disappearing back into the storm from which they had come. Silence fell over the courtyard, broken only by the sound of rain, and the Guardian's steady, radiant presence watching over the battlefield it had just ended, without spilling a single additional drop of blood. Cassian shifted back into human form, rushing immediately to Elira's side, his hands gentle, despite the desperate urgency in his movements, as he examined the wound on her shoulder. "You're hurt," he said, worry etched deep into every line of his face. "I'm alive," she said softly, exhaustion finally catching up with her now that the immediate danger had passed. "We're both alive." The Guardian turned its massive head toward them, its glowing eyes softening with something that looked remarkably like warmth. "The balance," it said, its ancient voice carrying gently across the quiet courtyard, "has finally been restored. Not through power claimed, but through love, freely given. 400 years of waiting, and it took only this." Elira looked up at the magnificent creature, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks, understanding finally settling fully into place after weeks of uncertainty and searching. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," the Guardian said, "the true work begins. Not the work of prophecy or ancient binding, but the simple, ongoing work of protecting what was nearly lost. That responsibility, I believe, belongs to both of you." Cassian's hand found Elira's, holding it gently, despite her injury, his gray eyes meeting hers with a certainty that needed no further words between them. Whatever challenges remained, whatever work lay ahead in healing centuries of division between human and shifter, they would face it together, guided not by ancient prophecy alone, but by the genuine bond that had, against every expectation, brought a Guardian back from 400 years of silence. The storm cleared by morning, leaving Kael'mor's courtyard washed clean beneath pale golden sunlight, though the wreckage of the previous night's battle remained scattered across the grounds, a stark reminder of how close disaster had come to the kingdom's gates. Elira woke in the castle's healing chambers, her shoulder wrapped tightly in clean bandages, the sharp sting of the wound dulled by whatever remedy Sable had prepared for her overnight. She found Cassian asleep in a chair beside her bed, exhaustion having finally claimed him sometime after ensuring her injury had been properly tended, his usually composed features softened in rest. She watched him quietly for a moment, still adjusting to the strange, warm feeling that settled in her chest whenever she looked at him now, before he stirred, his eyes opening slowly to find her awake and watching him. "You should be resting," he said, though a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, despite his words. "I've rested enough," she said. "What happened after I lost consciousness?" Cassian sat up straighter, reaching for her hand gently, as he began recounting the aftermath of the battle. Ashbrook's forces had retreated fully across the border, their earlier confidence shattered by the Guardian's overwhelming display of restored power. Scouts confirmed no further movement from Damon's territory throughout the remainder of the night, though Cassian suspected it would take considerably longer before any lasting peace could be trusted. "The Guardian remained in the courtyard until dawn," he continued, "though it has since returned to a resting form, no longer bound entirely in stone, but present in a way that suggests it will remain watchful, ready to respond should genuine need arise again." "And Thorn Hollow?" Elira asked, worry immediately rising at the thought of the clan members who had traveled so far to help defend a kingdom not originally their own. "Safe," Cassian assured her. "Sable and her people fought bravely alongside our forces. Several sustained minor injuries, but none critical. They are being cared for in the eastern wing alongside our own wounded." Relief flooded through her, and she allowed herself a moment to simply breathe, absorbing the reality that they had survived, that the kingdom had survived, that whatever came next could be faced without the immediate threat of Ashbrook's aggression hanging over every decision. "There's something else," Cassian said carefully, drawing her attention back to him. "Eldon has been examining the Guardian's own words from last night, along with the fuller history now available in the archive. He believes the Guardian's restoration marks more than simply the end of one threat." "What does he believe it marks?" "The beginning," Cassian said, "of genuine reconciliation between Kael'mor and the mountain clans, between human and shifter more broadly, in ways our kingdom has avoided pursuing for 400 years. Eldon believes this could be an opportunity to formally recognize Thornhollow, and any other surviving clan settlements, as full partners in Kael'mor's future, rather than isolated communities forgotten at our borders." Alira felt something warm settle in her chest at the thought, a sense of purpose beginning to take shape, beyond simply surviving the immediate danger that had brought her and Thornhollow together. "I would like to be part of that work," she said, "if you'll allow it." "Allow it?" Cassian repeated, something like disbelief coloring his tone. "Alira, after everything you've done, everything you've sacrificed and risked to protect this kingdom, I could not imagine building this future without you standing directly at the center of it." The sincerity in his words settled deep into her chest, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, simply existing together in the quiet warmth of the healing chamber, sunlight streaming gently through the windows. Their peace was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and Eldon entered, along with Sable, both carrying expressions that suggested important news awaited discussion. Rowan followed close behind, his usual guarded composure showing clear signs of relief now that the immediate crisis had passed. "Forgive the interruption," Eldon said, "but there are matters requiring attention, now that the immediate danger has settled." "What kind of matters?" Cassian asked, though he made no move to release Alira's hand as he addressed his historian. "Word of last night's events has already begun spreading beyond our borders," Eldon explained. "Neighboring territories are asking questions about the Guardian's restoration, about what it means for the broader balance of power across these lands. Some see it as opportunity for stronger alliance. Others, I suspect, may see it much as Ashbrook did, as a potential weapon worth pursuing. Then we need to be clear, immediately, about what the Guardian's restoration actually represents," Cassian said, his mind already turning toward the political implications of the situation. "Not conquest. Not weapon, but genuine partnership between all peoples this land has long kept separated." "I agree," Sable said, stepping forward. "Thornhollow is prepared to formally emerge from isolation, to stand openly as partners with Kael'mor, if you are willing to extend that same partnership in return." "I am," Cassian said without hesitation. "Beginning today, Thornhollow will be recognized as a protected and honored territory under Kael'mor's alliance, its people welcomed as full citizens with equal standing, not simply tolerated guests, kept at arm's length." Sable's eyes glistened with unshed tears at the declaration, decades of careful hiding finally giving way to genuine hope for a different kind of future. "On behalf of my people," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I accept that partnership gladly." The conversation continued for another hour, plans beginning to take shape for how Kael'mor and Thornhollow might work together moving forward, how word would be carefully communicated to neighboring territories to prevent misunderstanding or opportunistic aggression, how the Guardian's restored presence might best serve its true purpose of protecting balance, rather than becoming a source of renewed conflict. Throughout it all, Alira remained close to Cassian's side, contributing her own thoughts and perspectives, as someone who now understood both worlds, the mountain clan she had discovered, and the kingdom that had, despite everything, become her home. She noticed, with quiet satisfaction, that no one in the room questioned her right to be part of these important discussions, her earlier role as an overlooked servant girl, now entirely replaced by genuine respect for everything she had proven herself capable of. As the meeting finally concluded and the others departed to begin implementing the various plans discussed, Cassian remained behind, helping Alira rise carefully from the bed despite her lingering injury. "Walk with me," he said. "There's something I want to show you, now that the courtyard has finally settled." She agreed, and together they made their way slowly through the castle, emerging into the courtyard where the Guardian's presence still lingered, no longer contained fully within stone, but existing now in a form somewhere between physical and ethereal, a magnificent wolf, resting peacefully near the courtyard's center, its golden eyes opening gently as they approached. "Thank you," Illyra said softly, kneeling carefully beside the guardian despite her injury, "for choosing to trust me, even before I understood what that trust would require." The guardian's voice resonated warmly in response, no longer carrying the weight of ancient urgency, but something closer to genuine affection. "I did not choose you, child. I recognized you, the same way the balance itself recognizes those who carry genuine love for what they protect. That recognition existed within you, long before you ever understood its significance." Cassian knelt beside her, his hand finding hers once again, as they both remained close to the guardian's peaceful presence, sunlight warming the courtyard that had witnessed both destruction and restoration within the span of a single storm-filled night. "What happens now?" Illyra asked, looking between Cassian and the guardian, aware that whatever answer came would shape not just her own future, but the future of an entire kingdom, finally beginning to heal centuries of unnecessary division. "Now," the guardian said, its ancient voice carrying quiet wisdom, earned across 400 years of patient waiting, "you continue exactly as you have already begun. Not through grand gestures or singular acts of sacrifice, but through the daily choice to protect what matters, to build bridges rather than walls, and to trust that genuine love, freely given, remains stronger than any power claimed through force." Illyra looked at Cassian, finding in his steady gray eyes the same quiet certainty she felt settling within her own heart, and understood, with complete clarity, that whatever challenges still awaited them, they would face them together, guided by exactly the kind of partnership the Guardian had waited 4 centuries to witness restored. 3 months passed before Kael'mor finally felt like a kingdom fully at peace, though peace, Illyra had come to understand, required constant, careful tending, rather than simply arriving and remaining on its own. The changes throughout the kingdom had been significant. Thornhollow now stood openly connected to Kael'mor, its people traveling freely between the mountain settlement and the castle, sharing knowledge and traditions that had been isolated for far too long. Sable had taken on a formal role advising Cassian's court on matters concerning the old clans, ensuring that the mistakes of the past, the silence and separation that had allowed prejudice and fear to fester for centuries, would not be repeated moving forward. Ashbrook, remarkably, had not returned to aggression. Word had reached Kael'mor that Daemon's own council, shaken by witnessing the Guardian's true power firsthand, had quietly removed him from leadership shortly after the failed attack, replacing him with a cousin more interested in cautious diplomacy than conquest. Cassian had already begun careful negotiations toward a lasting peace between the two territories, though he remained appropriately cautious about trusting too quickly given their long history of conflict. Illyra had settled into her new role, with a confidence that still occasionally surprised her, given how recently she had been nothing more than an overlooked servant, carrying laundry through castle corridors. She spent her mornings continuing training, no longer purely for self-defense, but because she had discovered genuine enjoyment in the discipline and focus the practice required. Her afternoons were often spent working alongside Eldon in the archive, helping document the fuller history now being pieced together from both Kael'mor's records and Thornhollow's oral traditions, ensuring future generations would understand the true story of the Guardian's origin, rather than the incomplete fragments that had survived 4 centuries of separation. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, the courtyard bathed in the golden light of sunset, that Cassian found her sitting near the Guardian's resting form, sketching absently in a small journal Sable had gifted her weeks before. "You've become quite skilled," he observed, settling beside her, glancing at the careful drawing of the Guardian's peaceful, wolf-like form, taking shape on the page. "Sable says drawing helps settle a restless mind," Illyra said, smiling slightly as she closed the journal. "I think she might be right." Cassian was quiet for a moment, watching the last light of the setting sun catch against the Guardian's golden fur, before turning his attention fully to her, something in his expression suggesting he had been building toward this moment for some time. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "about everything that has happened since the night you first stood beside that statue, about the prophecy, about Thornhollow, about the sacrifice that finally restored the Guardian's true purpose." "What have you been thinking?" Illyra asked, curious about the unusual hesitation in his usually confident demeanor. "I've been thinking," he continued, "that the Guardian spoke of balance being protected through love, freely given, not once, but continuously, as an ongoing choice, rather than a single act. And I find myself wanting to make that same choice, deliberately and openly, for the rest of my life. Illyra's heart began to race as understanding dawned, watching him reach into his coat and withdraw a small, carefully crafted item, silver, like her mother's pendant, but shaped instead like two wolves standing together, their forms intertwined, in a way that suggested partnership rather than singular strength. "Illyra Hollowmere," Cassian said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability clear in his gray eyes. "You arrived at this castle with nothing, believing yourself unwanted and unclaimed by anyone. In the months since, you have shown me, and this entire kingdom, what genuine courage and genuine love truly look like. You did not simply awaken an ancient guardian. You awakened something within me I did not know I was missing, a partnership built not on duty or prophecy, but on genuine choice and genuine devotion." He knelt before her then, extending the silver pendant carefully. "I am not asking you to become my mate because prophecy demands it, or because political alliance requires it. I am asking because I love you, completely and without reservation, and because I cannot imagine building this kingdom's future, or my own future, without you standing directly beside me, exactly as an equal partner, rather than simply a prophesied guardian's chosen one." Tears filled Illyra's eyes as she looked at him, at the genuine vulnerability he had offered so openly, and she felt, for the first time in her entire life, the complete and overwhelming certainty of belonging exactly where she was meant to be. "Yes," she said softly, then more firmly, as joy overwhelmed the lingering disbelief that still occasionally surfaced from years of believing herself unworthy of such happiness. "Yes, Cassian, I choose you, completely and without reservation, exactly as you have chosen me." He rose, gently placing the pendant around her neck alongside the ones she already wore, her mother's silver wolf paw resting now beside this new symbol of partnership freely chosen, before pulling her into an embrace that spoke of everything neither of them needed words to express. Behind them, the guardian stirred gently, its golden eyes opening to observe the moment with quiet warmth, its ancient voice carrying softly across the peaceful courtyard. 400 years I waited," it said, "not simply for a bloodline to awaken my restoration, but for exactly this. A partnership built genuinely, freely, without coercion or ancient obligation forcing its existence. This is the balance I was always meant to protect." Illyra turned within Cassian's embrace to look at the magnificent creature that had, in its own patient way, brought them together across circumstances neither could have imagined only months before. "Thank you," she said again, though the words felt insufficient for everything the guardian's presence had ultimately given her. Not just a king's love, but a family in Thornhollow, a purpose in helping heal centuries of unnecessary division, and finally, after a lifetime of believing herself unwanted, the complete and unshakable knowledge that she belonged. News of their engagement spread quickly through Kaelmore, celebrated not just within the castle walls, but throughout the villages and settlements now connected more closely than they had been in centuries. Thornhollow's people arrived for the celebration that followed weeks later, joining Kaelmore's own citizens in festivities that honored not just the union between their king and his chosen mate, but the broader restoration of balance between all peoples the Guardian had always been meant to protect. Standing before the assembled kingdom on the day of their formal union, Illyra looked out over faces that had once regarded her with suspicion or simple indifference, now filled instead with genuine warmth and celebration. Sable stood proudly among the gathered crowd, representing Thornhollow's people with quiet dignity. Eldon watched with the satisfied expression of a historian who had finally witnessed prophecy fulfilled not through conquest or ancient magic alone, but through genuine human choice. Even Rowan, ever guarded and cautious, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he watched the ceremony unfold. The Guardian remained present throughout the celebration, its golden form resting peacefully near the courtyard's edge, no longer bound by ancient stone, but choosing, freely and willingly, to remain connected to the kingdom it had waited so long to see restored to genuine balance. As the ceremony concluded and Cassian took her hand, leading her forward to formally address their assembled kingdom for the first time as partners, rather than simply king and servant, Elira felt the full weight of everything that had changed since that ordinary evening months before, when she had simply been carrying laundry across a quiet courtyard. She had arrived at Kael'mor with nothing, an orphan with no name, no history, no claim to belonging anywhere in the world. She left that identity behind entirely now, standing instead as Elira Hollowmere Draven, daughter of Mira, chosen partner of Kael'mor's Alpha King, and guardian in her own right of a balance that had waited 400 years to be genuinely restored. The statue that had stood silent for 4 centuries no longer existed as simple stone. It had become, instead, a living symbol of what genuine love and genuine sacrifice could accomplish. A reminder to every generation that would follow that true strength was never found in power seized through force, but in the quiet, unwavering choice to stand beside what mattered most, regardless of the cost. And as the sun set gently over a kingdom finally at peace, Elira understood, with complete and unshakable certainty, that whatever challenges the future still held, she would face them exactly as the Guardian had always intended. Not alone, but together, with love freely given, and a family finally, completely, her own.